So we're sort of carrying on our series of mental health, and just to be completely transparent, this is what I kind of do for a job, neurodiversity in the workplace. So, but this is obviously different. And just as a bit of context, as we had our last meeting of Hearing God Together through January, I had this picture that came up of the. Do you remember that bit in the Bible where Jesus is on the cross, and what happens in the temple, at the back of the temple, when Jesus dies? The curtain. The curtain. Which way does it split? The easy way? The hard way, from top to bottom. And I just had this real sense that God is so often calling us to mingle the sacred with the rest of our life. And I think for me, there has been divide there. I don't know quite why. And I think when God sort of brings this stuff to the forefront, you suddenly go, okay, what's that all about? What does that look like? So that's just a bit of context for me. Anyway, so now we're going to talk a little bit about neurodiversity in the church. And I just want to, as we start to talk about this, I just want to start with Genesis 1, verse 27. And it just simply says, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. And I think this is a really important premise to start from when we talk about mental health, disability, difference, whatever it may be. If we are made in God's image, then that is good. We then need to work out what we need to do with that. But I think that's such an important starting point, as so often difference doesn't mean good for so many reasons. And I don't think that's okay. So let's talk a little bit. This happy, smiley, lovely face is pointing at you, by the way. I don't know if the direction's quite right. And the reason why is this term diversity has been around for a little while. And when it was first coined, it was talking about the autism movement, actually. It was a way of sort of describing autistic traits. But since then, it's sort of expanded to mean something a bit different. And now it means all of us, because we all think a little bit differently. But within that, we then have subsets of people that think a little bit more differently. And that's where we'll talk about some of the traits. And I use the word because diagnostic threshold, for those of you not familiar. Imagine, do you ever see those things in Tesco's where you sort of vote of the year when you put a little token in? Well, if you put tokens in and you get to the diagnostic threshold, yeah. But below the line, you might have lots of traits and stuff that look like that impact your life hugely, but you can't have the label. So that's why there's a difference between traits and diagnostic threshold. I think that's a really important concept to understand. So although neurodiversity is all of us, within that we have neurodivergent traits. And for some of us, we may describe ourselves as neurodivergent or neurodistinct. And there's lots of language about that. But noticing that, I think, is really helpful, because the whole theme here is that, and I really, really believe this, that labels are meant for tins of beans, not people. And I think that's a really important thing, because labeling can be really tricky, because as soon as I wear a label, that means all sorts of things and has loads of loaded kind of stuff around it that I think we just need to be really careful as we navigate. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about language. Can you have the next slide, Casey? So here's some language about neurodiversity. Gosh, I know it's small, I know. So just to pick out some of the words for those that can't quite see, we've got amygdala, we've got executive function, we've got ADHD, dyscalculia, words I can't even pronounce. But there's lots of it. Neurodistinct, neurospicy is a word that comes up. And the reason why I've thrown all this stuff up here really is that there's lots of language around this space. And actually, when people use it, sometimes they're talking about the same thing. Sometimes they're talking about something completely different. So my observation is it's really important when people use language in this space to ask them what they mean. And probably more importantly, what does that mean about our relationship? I.e., what needs to be different or what needs to work? So that might be around how we communicate, or how we do life, or how we work stuff out. Because actually, me just telling you, for example, that I'm dyslexic doesn't really mean anything. You might have some ideas about what dyslexia means, but it doesn't necessarily relate to me or how we're going to work together. But if I said to you, sometimes my short-term memory is so atrocious, I've already forgotten what we just talked about, that might be useful. And then we can work out what. Go to the next slide. Who's heard something? Yes. Has anyone got a full house?
No, not DCD.
Well, you probably so, but not all of some of the neurodevelopmental conditions. And I should probably share at this stage, I actually have a dyslexic diagnosis. I also have some screen traits around ADHD and autism. So what does that mean? Coming back to my lovely little diagram of the tokens going in the Tesco's called a sort of votingometer, some of those things aren't quite as high, and someone has screened those and said they're there, but you're nowhere near diagnostic threshold. But being aware of that's really useful. Now, that also talks into this diagram, because can you see all these lovely arrows everywhere? And that's really a way of me sort of trying to say co-occurrence or comorbidity, if you love a really heavy medical word, is the rule rather than the exception. So if you're in this space, i.e. you're seeing things that are present in this space, there's a high probability that you're likely to have more than one thing going on. And that's also because the way these conditions are sort of diagnosed, they're observed conditions, and there's overlap in the way they're observed and seen. So what I was just going to do now is just give you some sort of highlights around some of these conditions, if that's useful. Because one of the ways I really like to think about this is around strengths and difficulties. And one of the things I've been really trying to promote and get people to get their head around is, let's help individuals amplify their strengths, what they're great at, and manage the things that are tricky. Because if you can mitigate the tricky stuff and help people amplify what they're great at, you get happy people who generally are able to really sort of lean into the things that they're good at and find useful. So just sort of starting in no particular order at the top of the tree, we've got ASD or ASC. Anyone like to hazard a guess what that might stand for?
Autistic spectrum disorder.
Yes, absolutely. An autistic spectrum condition, also including things like Asperger's. Anyone heard of Asperger's?
You can't call it that anymore.
Well, you can't, can you? But some people do, and that's interesting, isn't it? So, and that's really important. Although it's not, you're absolutely right, Christine. It's not diagnosed anymore, but some people still associate themselves with that. And this comes back to the language thing. So some people would call themselves an Aspie or other word language. So what's really important is that we engage supportively with where someone is describing, because it's very easy to go down the route of that's not true, that's not a diagnosis anymore, I'm not taking that on board, as opposed to saying, well, actually, okay, well, tell me what that means. Because what's really important with the autistic spectrum, as with any of these conditions, they are spectrum disorders. And what that means is, I'm probably going to go off camera here, you can be all the way over here, and you can be all the way over here. Now, all the way over here may look like can't function, can't communicate, can't go to the toilet, can't do anything for oneself. And all the way over here might look running a university course / university, doing lots of what we might describe as high function. Again, I'm quite conscious of the language, that's dated language, but I'm sort of trying to work out what's a better way to say that. And there's a whole world in between, yeah? So again, coming back to this idea that we talk about autism and the autistic spectrum, if I tell you I'm autistic, where am I on that spectrum? And what does that mean for us in this relationship? And that's why I'd really encourage you to press in. So just get my notes here so I don't get too taken off route. So from a strengths point of view, I think it's really important to consider there is huge strength to the autistic spectrum. Just find where I'm on my notes. Lost my place, which is awful. I know. Yeah, so we have often a strength on focus, honesty, a clear view of what is right and wrong, which I think is really, really helpful. But that can be versus some challenges sometimes around change, communication skills, sometimes non-verbal communication. So all that lovely nuanced stuff that we have within our society can be really challenging. Now, those are generalizations, by the way. Again, I'm not saying that's true for everyone who sits in this space, but this is the stuff that I've observed and seen. And so being aware of that's really important. So in our church context, when we change stuff, for some people, that's a big deal. Even, I remember when we moved the chairs around and put these lovely tables out. For some people, that is a big deal because the world has changed. And it's not the fact they don't like it, it's just the fact it's changed. And where that builds into is that with many of these conditions, there's something called coping strategies, which is basically, how do I do life? I build a strategy for it, and that works. Now, if you change the rules, I've now got to reimagine or rework out what that strategy is going to look like for me. And that might be, how do I feel safe, for example. So thinking about that's really helpful. So let's move on to the next one. ADHD. Has anyone got any clues of what that might stand for? I guess there's some people that might identify with some of that. I don't know. Possibly, except for me.
Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Look at this, Christine. You are going to get top marks. You are flying. She's great, isn't she? So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It now also includes, because the language has shifted, there used to be something called ADD, so without the hyper bit. That sort of come together, but also changed a bit, because also now we talk about inattentive and hyperactive in terms of that space. And interestingly, the words attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for lots of people, bear no resemblance to how ADHD turns up. So again, the language is confusing and tricky. But from a broad sort of strengths point of view, we often have high energy, idea creators, life and soul of the party when they're in a good space. But that can be, I guess, balanced against some challenges around anxiety, difficulty with organisation sometimes, short-term memory sometimes comes into play, and sometimes hypersensitivity. There's also some stuff around this rejection sensitivity, oh gosh, dysphoria, that's it. So basically, best way to explain that, I'm more interested that you're okay than I'm okay. And I'll do anything. And that can be to a huge detriment personally. That's like saying yes to everything that moves because I don't want to upset you, for example. So knowing about that can be really helpful. And there's a whole load of work around that can be done around that in terms of boundaries and capacity. But being aware that that is there is really important. Also, emotional dysregulation. Not knowing about your emotions, not understanding your emotions or how you're feeling or being able to articulate that is a real big thing in this space. I can see some nodding heads. I'll get that. So, but living with that is quite interesting and challenging. So the next one I'm just going to pick up on is dyslexia. Probably the most diagnosed of these conditions, by the way, for whatever the media tells you, because of the link with lexic and with words. Now, interestingly, with dyslexia, I mean, here's a little quiz for you. What do you think the most common thing that comes up with dyslexia in terms of a difficulty?
Reading?
No, it's not reading.
It's not memory.
It's memory, yes, and it's short-term memory particularly.
Sequencing.
Sequencing as well comes into play, but short-term memory, interestingly, is the big thing. And because if your short-term memory is impinged, your working memory gets impinged, because if you can't hold it in the short term, you can't work with it, and you get into this kind of space.
But it's a superpower.
Well, let's talk about superpower. I'll hit that one head on, right? So we're going to come to this later. I think the way to think about it is that who likes Formula One here? Who's heard of Formula One? Who's heard of Formula One? We've got fast cars, yeah? Fast cars. They're really low to the ground. Have you noticed them? They've got about this much. I think the rules allow them that much ground clearance now, yeah? So if you're going on a racetrack, best car in the world is a Formula One car, especially a Formula One race, yeah? Now we want to go to Tesco's. I don't know, how many people are you shopping for this week, Emma? Five people in the shop floor. Now, how big's the boot on a Formula One car? It hasn't got one. It's not handy. And how do you get the other 5 people in the car with you to go to Tesco's? Another slight challenge. So, and then there's the speed bumps, because you can't go too fast in Tesco's, can you? But where I'm going with this, that it's about, I think there's absolute strengths here, absolute strengths, but it's context. It's what we're asking people to do and where we're asking people to do it is what the difference is. And that's the really important thing to think about. So the superpowers dialogue works to an extent, but I've worked with a lot of people who are completely disabled by that, because they go, well, my things don't work in this space. So I'm supposed to have this superpower, but I'm failing, and I don't know why. And it's then taking a look at the context. And I hope that's useful. But I think there are definitely some people who've got neurodivergent traits that have been very successful, and that's great. But let's look at the reality of the whole and the fact, as with everything, there's a small percentage of us that often exceed and do amazing things in the right space at the right time, whereas others are really challenged. So, but from a dyslexic point of view, just as, again, a broad brush, we often have strengths around big picture thinking. These are the people that can see how all the dots are lined up together. They can walk in a space and sort of see the overall picture, which is amazing. Often some emotional intelligence sometimes. They cover that sometimes.
But that's versus, as we've talked about, short-term, some challenge over short-term memory and processing and changes again, because often there's a lot of strategy involved in doing right. The next one, DCD, which we touched on, which otherwise known as dyspraxia. Has everyone heard of dyspraxia or come across it? Yeah. So it's similar to dyslexia, but the word that's changed is the lexic, which is kind of that word connotation, as opposed to the praxis, which is about movement, the gross motor skills and the fine motor skills. So often there is some strengths around courage and creativity, being able to, and again, a lot of the interpersonal skills, but versus some challenges around coordination, short-term memory, again, sometimes sleep and navigation turn up. Now, the last of the sort of DIS group, and by the way, this is not an exhaustive list, there are others that I've not listed, these are some of the common ones that come up, is dyscalculia. Has anyone come across that? Yeah? So it's numbers, yeah, so it's kind of related to numbers, but it's also about quantity. So time, estimating things. This all comes into play here. So being aware of that is really, really important. Right. So we've got time, quantity, math. And the last one there is tic disorder. So you've probably heard with the tics. So what I was going to say, there's dyscalculia, we've got strength, there's lots of strengths around the emotional stuff again, but the tricky bits or the challenge often around time, estimating, any sort of transposing of numbers can be really, really challenging as well. The last one is tic disorders I was going to pick up on, and that's, I mean, you've probably come across Tourette's, which is involuntary use of sometimes expletives or certain language. That's only a small part of this tic space. We've also got individuals who have other involuntary movements, or sometimes it's stimming, or sometimes there's other things going on. Now, from a strengths point of view with the tic space, there's often great accuracy and attention to detail, but with some challenges around particularly about fitting into society, actually. So some of the people, my friends have got tic disorders, really struggle with how they turn up and being very, because they're often very aware of what's going on, but unable to change that, and that can be quite difficult. So the last thing I put on here is depressive feelings. The reason why I mention that is because one of the components of this stuff is that people often wear masks. Has anyone sort of come across that term, masking? And that's where we wear something because we've maybe got a learned behaviour that says, this is how I become socially acceptable in a space. I know this isn't just about neurodiversity, but it's in lots of spaces, but it's particularly relevant here. Now, if people have to wear masks all the time, masks are heavy, and I mean that in a metaphorical sense, but in a reality sense as well. And the other thing about masks is they generally have to come off at some point, and that's generally with the people we care about most, I've noticed, which is complicated. That means we get blowouts, we get tantrums, we get awkward situations, because, and I think with that, there's a whole process that's often useful around working out what's safe enough to unmask so you don't have to bring that into that space. Yeah. And that again is relevant in the church context, because just thinking about how do we make sure we create a space that's safe enough for people to be themselves. Yeah. So that they don't have to be masked here as well, especially if they're working out what that looks like in the rest of life. I'm getting my notes out of order, so I'm going to start throwing on the floor, I think. Here we go. Right, so get the next slide, please, Casey. Great. So the other component to this is, we've talked about strengths and challenges. Now, because we're all real people, when things aren't going too well, and I love this hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, I don't know if anyone's come across all before, it tends to amplify some of the things that are difficult. So being aware of that in the context is really important. So what are we doing to make sure the space works well? And I think particularly in the church, the thing that jumps out to me is that loneliness, actually. How do we, because actually if we're about being a community, how do we make sure that people aren't lonely in that and appropriate, you know, and supporting them appropriately, so then they can be the best selves within it. Can we have the next slide, please? Next, Steve. Oops. Oh, go back one, please. So as we think about that, the thing I wanted to just emphasize is, I've talked about neurodiversity here and neurodivergent traits, but that's only ever part of who a person is. Because it's only, and the way I like to think about it is, it's a lens to look through, not a label to be worn. Because actually we're all made up of our racial background, our religious background, our social economic background, where we live, the person we met at the bus stop, our education, our job, all that stuff influences who we are. And this is only part of that. And this really, for me, plays into this idea that we have to treat people as individuals and not stick them in lovely little boxes, which I know the human mind so often wants us to do. Because actually, when we talk about neurodivergent strengths, there's energy, there's imaginativism, there's analytical thinkers, inquisitive, fresh pairs of eyes, and that's versus some challenges that we touched on around short-term memory, anxiety, fear, and sometimes this masking piece. Can we have the next slide, please, Casey? And the other reason why this is important, and I know we have an employment lawyer in the room, which is very exciting, is that actually there's legislation as well, because actually it's a protected characteristic of disability. So if you have something that's going to impact you for more than 12 months, or is likely to, you're protected under this thing called the Equality Act. So that's why it's really important that we think about that. Now, without going into any details of that, the most important thing about the Equality Act is it recognises that that's about direct and indirect discrimination. So direct discrimination is where you just treat someone differently because of the way they turned up. But indirect discrimination may be we do something and we maybe treat everyone the same, but in treating everyone the same, we're impacting someone. And that could be something as simple as the volume we have our PA. It might be so loud here that someone here is into sensory overload. And therefore we treat everyone the same, but that person is experiencing something that is just awful. And being aware of that and working out is really important. And what the Act talks about is this idea of reasonable adjustments. And that's something to say, well, what's reasonable that we can do to support each other in a loving way so that that's not an issue. And something to be reasonable, it needs to be practical, it needs to fit within the cost of the organisation, and it needs to be something we can actually do. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? How we do it? I realise I've talked far too much. Right, so what I'm doing, I'm just going to skip ahead on the next two because I'm just conscious of time. So I'm just going to show you a very short video. There is some flashing in this, by the way, just to warn you. It's no, not flat. It's just flashing lights. So what I want to share it with you is just because I could talk to you about what sensory overload is, and that'd be really fascinating, obviously, and you'll all be really encouraged. But it's better to see it sometimes. So this is a young man. It's a cartoon, so it's not a real person, but this does happen for real people going into a cafe. Yeah, simple. Yeah, you think that was fine? We've all been in cafes. Just take a look and see what you're noticing. Okay. What did you notice when you watched it? So everything. Okay. Wow, that's a lot. Did anyone else? Yeah, it's big, isn't it? Yeah, it's really interesting.
We don't realise how much we, what do you call it, zone out?
Yeah, screening out, isn't it? It's got a bit of barrier.
Yeah. But I saw another one which was like a little boy with his mum in the shopping centre, and it's the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
And at the end, it looks like he sort of shuts down.
Yeah. It's a big, and it's almost like. So someone described this to me, and I guess I've experienced it myself. Is that it's kind of like those ships, and they have their radars. Everyone sort of seen that, the ship with the radar sort of screen, and it's kind of like sometimes some of us can manage our radars quite well. We can close them in when everything's a bit noisy or broad them out. But for some people, their radars are on maximum the whole time. So they're picking up everything, and all this information's coming in, and they can't manage it, but it's just coming in. And it's kind of, and this can sometimes look a bit like sitting with Claudius over there while Dan and Lucy are having a conversation and being absolutely tuned into that. And I've solved their problems for them while talking to Claudius. That's what that can turn up like. But they're not happening at multiple times, all the time. It's just a lot going on. So just being aware of that, I think, is sometimes just a bit of a game changer. I don't know about you, but even someone that sometimes experiences this, to see that in that way is quite different, isn't it, sometimes? By the way, I'm not saying we can fix this, but being aware of it's useful. And then it's like, well, what does that look like? And we'll just talk about in terms of what good steps moving forward are. So, and that probably brings me on neatly to the next slide, actually. There we go. So I touched on the Equality Act earlier. So the Equality Act has got this idea of reasonable adjustments. Now, reasonable adjustments broadly fit under two models. Do you know what they are? Pardon me. Two models. So, oh, look at you, Lucy. Did I write it on there? I did, didn't I? No, I didn't. Oh, I did. Yeah, sorry. So, well done, Lucy Colson, for actually reading the slides. Unbelievable. Gosh, you must teacher. I think that prophetic word there, teacher for you. Sorry, but yeah, you're right. So sorry. So there's these two models of medical and social. So the medical model, and I know it's kind of a little. I'm not down on doctors at all, by the way, for any doctors present. I'd just like to just apologise because I know it does seem a bit like the problem and the sad person. But the medical model is just based around this idea that the person is broken. Person is broken. We fix person. Yeah. Then person can fit into society. Everything will be peachy. And that does kind of work to an extent. There is stuff that's useful to do with the person, but the problem is if we forget the idea that actually the person, coming back to what Christine was talking about, the superpowers piece, actually sometimes the person wasn't broken at all until we put them in the situation. You know, I'm thinking for me, you know, if I got that wonderful job as an administrator, filling in forms all day, making sure Excel spreadsheets were updated, things were done on time, that might detract slightly from some of my better qualities forever. So just sort of thinking about that's really important, and we can modify that. That could be around processes, that can be around the way we are and be. And when we talk about the medical model, it's more about sort of like sometimes it's equipment, sometimes it's coaching, sometimes it's just, you know, help supporting the individual to develop strategies. But I personally believe these two models fit together really well. But it's important we don't try and do one in isolation without the other. And I think that has things in our context here. Actually, some of it's about how we do stuff and how we meet together. And some of it's about meeting with people and saying, well, actually, as we think about that situation, what's going to be most useful to you? So you can turn up and be fully present and feel safe enough. Or maybe it's about some people saying, well, actually, I don't want to come on a Sunday because actually I find it too overwhelming, but I really want to be part of this church. And that maybe looks different. And to make sure that we as a community are saying, okay, so how do we be community and be church in that without putting in rules that potentially push people into a difficult space here? So that's just as an offer there. Just so now. Next slide, please, Casey. So I'm not going to completely run over time here. So a couple of things to think about as we think about not solutions, but I think ways to move forward. Ask, I think, is such an important part of this. And what I mean by ask is so often we can assume things like that everyone knows what they need. Everyone asks if they need help. I mean, how many people have we known that are not asked because they're either embarrassed or they feel that it's not for them? They know who and how to ask for help, or where even to start with the whole process. But I think asking in a way that doesn't diagnose, that's the other thing I was going to say here, as we become aware of some of these traits, we have no right to diagnose, but we have a right to notice, I think. And that might be, this looks tricky, what can we do different? Or I'm just wondering what's going on here. I'm just wondering if I can be supportive or whatever it might be, but asking for that generosity in that space of how do we move things forward. The next bit about that asking is partnership. How do we partner? And what I mean by that is, I don't know how many of you feel like this. Lots of us have had things done to us. And I don't know about you, but I always find that a bit difficult when people do things to me. But when people do things with me, it transforms everything because we've both got agency and we both can work out how to move forwards. Because I haven't got the quote of me, I'm going to completely misquote it, but try and get the essence of it. The place I'm asking you to come, I'm not asking you to come to me and I'm not going to go to you, but we're going to go together to a new place. And I think that's really important, this as well, because as we do that, it changes everything. And then we discover new stuff because, you know, we think fundamentally about the church and what it is. It's a movement. A movement's all about going to new places and moving, isn't it? And I looked up this thing and it was quite helpful in terms of thinking about what is partnership. Partnership is about, you know, having shared goals and objectives. They might be really small things or really big things. It's about actually working out and researching what we need to do together. It's about being open and honest and having regular communication, sometimes call it a heartbeat, checking we're okay and it's all working. A willingness to put some skin in the game, because we can't do partnership if we don't offer anything of ourselves, can we? Because that's just transactional. You know, to trust your partners enough to move forward, and also have a good idea about what's good enough for now in terms of how we move forwards, because we can't solve all this stuff in a perfect way because Jesus hasn't come again, but we can always move forwards a little bit, can't we, to what good might look like. So the next slide, please, Casey. And this kind of fits with this, and this obviously is a world-renowned model that I designed in my front room, so you've seen it here. And it's really simple, it's just this correct model. I tried to make the words work. So, you know, just change processes to be inclusive from the start. Let's be open and diverse in our teams. Let's review what's working. Remove the unnecessary. I'd always argue that's a great one. Engage with the person, not the label. Check in and review what our work settings and what's working or not. And then the final, the T bit, I think is probably the key bit. Let's take nothing for granted. Because it's so easy to take stuff for granted, especially when we've met individuals who've maybe presented in a certain way before. It's very easy to assume that that's what it's going to be like with this relationship. It's like sneak previews, I love it. Looks like cookies. And the bit that holds this all together, John, give us the next slide, is what these two boys are doing. You probably can't see because their mouths. Obviously, I've protected them, although you probably will know who they are. But the point is they're having a conversation in a very different space. They're actually at the Cambridge Technology Museum. And actually, I witnessed this conversation. They were discussing something that was quite passionate about both of them. But they went to a different place to have that conversation. And I would say so often when we hit tricky bits or trying to work stuff out, having a conversation in a different space, a bit like the Ladies' Day, actually, you know, because actually we need to sometimes have a conversation in a different space to work out how to move forwards, and then we get a better perspective. The way I like to think about it is always like, if we've got a picture in our head, we need to paint the picture or draw the picture so that we can look at it, and taking that to a different space is a really helpful way of working out how to move this stuff forwards. And then the final bit I was going to finish on, if we have a few moments, I'm happy to pick up on any questions afterwards.
Maybe that could happen while...
That maybe I could. I've got a poem though, can I finish my poem? So, did I write it? I adapted it. This is going to be good if I know. If neurodiversity is being invited to the party, neuroequity is being given the right transport to get there, neuroinclusion is being asked to dance, then neuroequality is dancing like nobody's watching. How do we get the invites out? For me, that's formed quite a lot of my thinking around this. And I think that's as true in what we do here, actually. You know, that's what Jesus' message is about, actually. You know, that, I mean, I guess we've all heard models like believe, belong, behave, and that sort of stuff. But actually, how do we genuinely take the heart of Christ? Because I think the heart of Christ is partnership. The heart of Christ is asking. The heart of Christ is sitting alongside people and working it out together. Not so they'll conform to the ideas that we have, but that so we both knowing the living God will move forwards together into what the kingdom's got. But bless you, seriously. And if you want to know more about it, there's obviously, this is just like not even scratching the surface. We can go deeper if needs be, but bless you.
Thank you.